Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. With the passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse will once again be thrust into the national spotlight. As a senior Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Whitehouse is being looked to by his party to lead the fight in the confirmation hearing of President Trump's nominee. Now, Whitehouse has been here before, of course, and drew a lot of criticism for his controversial questioning of then-nominee Brett Kavanaugh. My colleague Ted Nesi asked Senator Whitehouse about his thoughts on the high-stakes confirmation process ahead and to reflect on the Kavanaugh hearings. An important note to our viewers, Ted's interview with the senator was recorded Wednesday morning.
Senator Whitehouse, thanks for joining me, and we have so much to talk about. I want to dive right in. First, we of course have to talk about the death of Justice Ginsburg, and I'm curious, I mean, especially as someone who's so involved in debates over the judiciary, were there rumors in Washington that she'd gotten very ill at this point and it might be headed this way, or were you taken by surprise, like many of us were, out in the public?
No, there were some of the people who cover in your profession, who cover the court very closely, had an inkling that things were going this way.
So you saw this you knew we might be headed for this late campaign season confirmation. So I mean, first, you've spoken about her a bit in recent days, but just, what stands out to you most about Justice Ginsburg's legacy, especially as you see this unbelievable outpouring of grief from many people, especially progressives?
Yeah, well, she combined some really wonderful qualities together. She was extraordinarily persistent and very innovative in the way that she framed arguments. She was generally very collegial and didn't speak with a loud voice. She spoke softly, but she carried the big stick of a very powerful intellect, a very innovative mind, and a real desire for justice and to clean up some of the injustices in American society. And I think if you look at the way in which she changed the entire approach of American law with respect to gender issues and discrimination between men and women, she's going to go down in history as one of the most consequential figures in the 200 plus years that we have been a democracy. She's a big deal.
So let's turn to the confirmation fight. As you can imagine, I have a bunch of questions for you about where it stands. I was trying to feel by my math, you're fourth most senior Democrat now on the Senate Judiciary Committee, which of course will be central to the confirmation process coming up. I want to ask you first, look, the Republicans are pretty clear here, and it's looking, I should say to folks at home, we're taping this midweek, and there could be a nominee from President Trump by the time they see this over the weekend. But the Republicans say, hey, we have the votes. There's nothing in the Constitution saying you can't do this so close to an election. What do you say to that argument from the Republicans that, hey, Democrats would do the same thing if a conservative justice had opened up and they had the votes in the Senate and the White House?
Well, I think the hypocrisy factor of what they said when they were stiff-arming President Obama over a very moderate Justice Garland in order to hold a seat open for a much more extreme Justice Gorsuch, and the way they're behaving now is worthy of note. I think that is an important 180 to point out to the American people, not just because it's a 180 and not just because it's hypocrisy, but because I think it's one of a number of signals that something very weird is going on in judicial nominations. If you look at Mitch McConnell basically deciding not to legislate in the Senate in order to keep the conveyor belt of judicial nominations going, if you look at his willingness to smash through rules and norms of the Senate as a supposed institutionalist for the judges, another weird behavior. The 180 is a weird behavior. And as you point out, they have been able to round up votes for a nominee before they know who the nominee is. That's a little weird. So it raises a lot of questions about what's really going on here and what forces of influence have been brought to bear on this. And I think that is something that is very much worth looking at in this whole process.
Well, let me ask about that. I've been reading and following, since I covered you, your ongoing discussion about all the money that conservatives, business groups have been putting behind the fight over judicial nominations in recent years. You were in the U.S. House just yesterday testifying about it. You're on cable news about it. But my pushback question for you, Senator, on it, I guess, is yes, there's a ton of money behind it, and it's clearly a very organized effort to put conservative justices on the court. At the same time, even without that money, isn't this also just ideologically what the Republican coalition wants? They want conservative justices, and it just happens there's also a ton of money behind that effort, but it's also bubbling up from their voters?
Yeah, that's really the point, I think, Ted. You've hit the nub of the issue. Does this effort intend to advance conservative judicial theory on the court? Originalism, minimalism, respect for precedent, avoidance of appellate fact-finding, the sort of suite of judicial principles that have long been associated with the name conservative judicial principles. In my experience, looking at this and living this, that is not what is going on. What is going on is an effort for the court to rule in favor of conservative political interests. That is a very different thing. And if you look at the behavior of the Roberts Court, you see it playing out in 80 partisan 5-4 decisions that gave wins for big Republican donor interests. You've been around a long time. 80 is a lot of Supreme Court decisions. And there's a very big difference between a court that will follow conservative judicial principles and get to whatever result they dictate, and a court that wants to get to results that will provide victories for Republican political interests. And that is the difference we're fighting over, I believe.
Can you name, then I'm just curious, who's a conservative justice you admire in recent decades, or someone you thought, it was being driven more by a conservative principle, in jurisprudence versus, in your view, this organized effort to come to certain outcomes?
So let's look at the issue of dark money. If my hypothesis is right, that very big dark money interests are behind this, the number one thing that they want to do is make sure that courts will protect their dark money operation, because that is the evil that permits all their other evils to transpire. So dark money then becomes a really big deal. So if you look at Justice Scalia, for instance, in the Citizens United decision, he wrote his own opinion. He specifically said, look, transparency matters. You've got to be able to stand up in a democracy for your own views. Now, as I ask big, powerful interests about dark money, I'm starting to get pushback from them saying, oops, can't answer your question. I've got a First Amendment right not to disclose who's giving me money. It's like pleading the fifth, it's pleading the first. So clearly this group wants to move the court away from where Scalia was and to a place where the court will say, hey, new constitutional right here. If you're a big special interest, you not only have a constitutional right to spend unlimited money, you have a constitutional right to hide all these activities behind screening apparatuses of various kind and turn it into dark money. So there would be a very live conflict within the conservative movement, because I think everybody will agree Scalia, from a purely conservative point of view, he's got the cred.
Yeah, he was, I think, we generally, viewers will probably agree with us that he was a conservative justice. So let's talk about the upcoming confirmation hearing, which looks like it will be happening potentially very soon in the heat of this election. You know well, you've taken some real criticism on the right in particular about your lines of questioning at the Kavanaugh hearing, particularly examining his yearbook. And I heard your background as a prosecutor, which I know sometimes comes out as I track you in the Senate as you were looking at that, but they say it was over the top, it was too personal, it was sophomoric. Do you have any regrets about how you handled your lines of questioning in the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, and will you have any difference in how you handle this one?
Well, this will be very different, because we won't have a situation that we had in Kavanaugh, which is that we had a Supreme Court nominee who late in the process turned out to have a very credible issue that he'd engaged in a sexual assault. the person was willing to identify themselves, they were willing to come forward, they had quite a credible story to tell, and they were willing to testify and present themselves to attack and examination in the Senate Judiciary Committee. You can't ignore, when somebody's about to go onto the Supreme Court, an allegation of a past sexual assault. So we had to look at that because it was front and center if you believe that Supreme Court justices should not have committed sexual assaults in their past. And so that was where the conversation was driven by that set of circumstances. And whether he was telling the truth about it was very much related to the contemporaneous evidence, including things that he said in his yearbook and things that his friends said about him at the time and all of that. So all of that was devoted to a very legal type testing of the veracity of what he was saying about that central issue. Are we about to put a sexual assailant onto the United States Supreme Court? So this is going to be totally different. Those questions I don't think are going to come up in any respect. That was a 1 in a million type proposition that set of factual circumstances would arise.
So I want to ask you, as we wrap up here, about some of what's coming from the left. I've been asking a lot about the commentary from the right. And one thing, there was a rally at your office in Senator Reed's, or I believe it was at court actually, but to get the attention of you and Senator Reed, from folks on the left, progressive activists who are basically calling for shutting the Senate down. And you and I won't bore the viewers with exactly how unanimous consent works and everything, but there's a lot of technical stuff that happens to keep the Senate operating day to day. To what extent do you think that is a strategy in play for Senate Democrats to just grind the Senate to a halt? And to what extent are people not being realistic about if McConnell has 51 votes, Trump's justice is likely to get confirmed?
If there were a triple secret procedural strategy that would allow us to do that, I think we probably would have done it on Gorsuch after the trick that the Republicans pulled on everybody with Garland. And I think we probably would have done it with Kavanaugh after the incomplete investigation and the sort of ramrod nature of that confirmation. So there just isn't some unused triple secret procedural device that we have in our back pocket that we didn't use beforehand. And we know very well that Mitch McConnell will use whatever procedural countermeasures he has at his disposal. And we also know that if we're going to take back the Senate in a race in which decency and normalcy versus Trump's behavior is very much an issue, and Trump is desperate to try to make Democrats look as badly behaved and dangerous and odd and extreme as possible, we want to be very careful about playing into that narrative. And we, I think, want to make sure that we are being as responsible and aggressive as we can, that we do everything in our power to slow this down. But the worst possible situation is that we engage in activities around the Senate that are ineffectual in stopping this nominee, whoever she, I guess, may be, and at the same time damage all of our candidates who are out there running by causing the public to think, oh, maybe they're both the same.
Final question, Senator, and it's along those same lines. So there are also those who say, all right, if the Republicans push through their nominee and put that ninth justice on the court this fall, and Democrats do take back the Senate and Joe Biden wins, then turnabout is fair play, pack the court, end the filibuster, add justices, and those, I don't have to tell you, you've been in the Senate 14 years. Those are quite radical steps, but there is also more. You're hearing, even Senator Markey was suggesting that the other day, who until the last year was not always a radical fellow. What do you make of that?
So Democrats are very active and very passionate people. It's kind of in our nature. And one of the things we love is quarrelsome hypotheticals to fight with each other over. Right now, I think it's much more important that we engage in the real battle in front of us, which is winning the election in November. I will go so far as to say that if, and this is an if, we're not there yet, if we take the Senate and it goes into Democratic hands, I believe that this behavior, first with Garland and Gorsuch, then with the sped up Kavanaugh fake investigation, then now with this hypocritical reversal 180 for whoever the nominee is going to be, our Republican colleagues will have forfeited any right to cry foul on any procedural maneuver that we may choose to undertake in the Senate. We simply can't have a situation in which, when the Republicans are in charge in the Senate, all procedures, all rules, all norms are optional and can be broken at will. And then those very same people who did so much damage to the institution then get to pretend to blow the whistle on us if we try to engage in similar measures. So I think they forfeited their rights if they continue on the path that they're on. And we'll just have to see what we decide to do. But they will have lost any credibility to blow the whistle if they think a whistle should be blown.
All right, Senator Whitehouse, I assume we'll hear a lot from you in the coming weeks as all this plays out. I appreciate you taking the time.
Good to be with you.
When we come back, Ted Nesi joins me in studio with a conservative voice on the confirmation process and a look ahead at a high-stakes public corruption trial with some key General Assembly players front and center. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White, and I am joined by 12 News politics editor Ted Nesi. Ted, good to see you back in studio again. I want to talk a little bit about the first half interview you had with U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and his role in the high-profile role in the confirmation process for the next U.S. Supreme Court justice. You and I have covered Senator Whitehouse for a long time. What did you learn from your interview this week?
Well, one of the things that stuck out to me, Tim, was that Senator Whitehouse is not there where some progressive activists are who say, for example, State Rep Aaron Regenberg has been organizing rallies led with some other progressives to talk about that Democratic senators should do absolutely everything they can to stop the Senate from doing anything to block Trump from making this appointment and having it confirmed.
Including shutting the Senate down. And what do you mean? I mean, you're right. A lot of people think of Senator Whitehouse as the super liberal senator, but yet he's stopping short of doing that. Why do you think so?
Yeah, well, I've always thought Sheldon Whitehouse was not quite as liberal as people think he is. I mean, remember, he was a prosecutor. You know, he comes out of a kind of law and order, prosecution, law enforcement. There's generally a more conservative bent to coming out of that part of the political government sphere. He's certainly a liberal Democrat, don't get me wrong, but I think he's not, and some people see him as far left as you can get, AOC, all that. I don't think he's there. And I actually think there could be some tension for both him and for Senator Reid as they face pressure, if there's a lot of pressure from the Democratic grassroots, to take pretty radical steps in the Senate, like not allowing, make them read every bill out loud before votes, the Republican majority. Don't allow any proceeding with committee hearings that follow the rules to the letter of the law, kind of work to rule like we see in union disputes. So I just found it interesting that he opposes giving Trump this pick and wants to fight it, but he's not necessarily willing to do what some on the left want.
So I want to bring in a conservative voice here, Ted. You also interviewed Robert Flanders. He's a former Rhode Island Supreme Court justice here in this state. And he unsuccessfully ran against Senator Whitehouse as a Republican in 2018. His criticism of the senator has not waned, as we saw in your piece Wednesday night. He also says Republicans are within their rights to take this action with the Supreme Court nominee. Let's take a listen.
This is a business of a political act, whether or not to confirm a judge. Judges are not conceived in an immaculate setting. It's quite a political act. There's no judicial review of a decision to deny or confirm a judge. 29 times, Ted, this has happened in an election year of a president. And 19 of those times, when it's the same political party, all but 2 have been confirmed. So there's a long history of this situation. And the political fact is that when the president and the Senate are controlled by the same party, it's much easier to confirm a nomination as compared to when they're not. And history bears that out.
That is former Rhode Island Supreme Court Justice Robert Flanders with you, Ted, earlier this week. Did you ask him at all about the Democrats' call of what they call the hypocrisy by Senate Republicans who wouldn't humor President Obama's choice of Merrick Garland right before the November elections.
Yeah, I mean, a huge part of the anger among Democrats is that they already gave up the Scalia seat in an election year when they had the presidency because the Republicans in the Senate didn't allow a vote. Now, Trump might get one even closer to an election because they have both. Flanders' argument is one you're hearing for the same thing from Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, which is, hey, we have the GOP has the Senate and has the White House. That was not the case in 2016. The Democrats only had the White House, not the Senate. And that means we have the votes, we have the agreement on who this nominee should be, and so we can do it. Nothing in the Constitution says that expires close to an election. But of course, there was such a focus in the Republican messaging in 2016 on it's an election year, let the people decide, let them make a decision, that I think, a lot of Americans are open to listening a little bit to the fairness question. And, if there was that level of concern about being close to an election, we're now 5 weeks out, basically.
I was taking a look, and Republicans have had better luck with Supreme Court justices in modern history. Richard Nixon had 4, Ronald Reagan had 4, Bush 1, who was only one term, had 2, Bush 2 had 2. President Trump is now poised for 3. On the flip side, Obama and Clinton each had 2, Ginsburg, of course, being one of Clinton's picks. Carter had none, and Ford with just 1. So Republicans have really been able to put more justices on the Supreme Court.
And yet that fact drives a lot of Republicans nuts because they say we've dominated the presidency and the Supreme Court for a generation or two, and yet we always somehow wind up without enough votes to overturn Roe v. Wade. To get, Obamacare was upheld by John Roberts, a George W. Bush pick. Anthony Kennedy legalized same-sex marriage. He was a Ronald Reagan pick. Actually, I believe he replaced. Was it Robert Bork or the one with the pot smoking in the 80s? Well, anyway, you can't even remember all your history on this. But just to say, they feel like once they get a Republican on the court, too often they drift. They become a little too moderate.
I don't know if it's drifting. I think what we've seen from the Supreme Court is that the justices are very keyed in on precedent, right? And it takes a lot to overturn prior decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court.
Clarence Thomas would overturn a lot of things right now.
But let's look at Chief Justice John Roberts in the most recent abortion decision in Whole Women's Health versus Texas. That one, he wanted to uphold some of the abortion restrictions. But then when Louisiana came up this time around, he said, look, we've decided on this. Even though I made one decision one way, we're going to stick to it here. And I think we see that a lot with the Supreme Court.
Well, I think also you can't get away with the Supreme Court, and I know we're going to wrap up this topic, but the Supreme Court is a political body in the end. It is a judicial body, but it's also, John Roberts is aware that the court's legitimacy in the eyes of the public relies in part on it not seeming like it's just politicians in robes who, if there's a Republican majority, it always goes the Republican way, or a Democratic majority goes this way. So I think that there's that piece of it too, kind of a little realpolitik in their chambers.
So I want to get local here in Rhode Island. Coming up, we have a very high stakes, I would say, public corruption trial with the former political aide to Speaker Nicholas Mattiello. His name is Jeff Britt. You've probably heard his name in the news a lot. He's been charged in 2 counts, a felony money laundering charge and a misdemeanor campaign finance charge. This goes back to the Speaker's re-election in 2016 in a controversial mailer. We have a lot of the history on WPRI.com. Again, that starts Monday, October 5th. Speaker Mattiello, who you see on the screen right now, is one of the potential witnesses for the defense here. But I do want to stress, Ted, this is potential. Just because he's on the list doesn't mean he will necessarily testify. It depends what the prosecutors present, and then the defense will decide what they want to do. But a couple of quick important notes. This is a bench trial. This is not a jury trial, so a judge will ultimately decide here. It is expected to take a week long. And as we were talking about before the show, unlike many of the public corruption trials, this is not in federal court. It's in state court.
Yeah, which I would say only makes this a worse situation for Speaker Mattiello. I mean, you don't have to be Karl Rove to know that having to testify in a corruption trial stemming from your 2016 re-election campaign is not a great look a few weeks left in your 2020 re-election
Especially
campaign.
When cameras are allowed in state court.
Exactly.
Not
It'll
in
be on
federal
all
court.
the television stations and in the papers. And so I think, you have to see how it goes. Obviously, Speaker Mattiello has not been, indicted or anything like that. He's just a witness. But certainly, certainly, a very smart person who's been around politics a long time said to me that, Ted, you and I know campaigns. He said campaigns aren't always pretty on the inside. You do what you have to do, hopefully within the bounds of the law, and but having the kimono open to the public and having them see exactly kind of how operatives work, especially in the heat of a campaign, the public may not love what they hear and see.
And the spokesperson for the Mattiello campaign pointed out in a statement to us when we were reporting on the subpoenas that went out that, hey, look, he was cleared of any wrongdoing in this case, and just Jeff Britt is on trial here. Of course, Jeff Britt has pleaded not guilty, which is why they are going to trial. Do you think real quick, 30 seconds, does he was cleared resonate with voters in District 15? I know time will tell.
Yeah, well, certainly, you're better to not be the person in the dock, right, in this kind of thing. But I think, look, he's been a speaker a long time. There have been a lot of controversies during his time as speaker, and to some extent, they just bubble up. And of course, he has a very competitive challenger in Barbara Ann Fenton Funk, so it's going to be something to closely watch in the coming weeks.
All right, thank you all for watching this week. For Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.